Through the summer of 1990, apartment 213 became both Jeffrey Dahmer's refuge and the stage where his darkest compulsions started repeating, like a script he couldn't stop performing. Each night, he returned from the Ambrosia chocolate factory with the same numb expression, the same heavy silence following him up the cracked stairwell, the same dread pulsing behind a calm facade. The neighbors saw him as an odd but harmless man, quiet, polite, always carrying grocery bags or cleaning supplies, always looking tired. He avoided eye contact in the hallway and slipped into his apartment with the door shutting quickly behind him, like he couldn't let the outside world in for even a second. By June 1990, Jeffrey met his next victim, Edward Eddie Smith, 28 years old. Eddie was outgoing, charismatic, someone who carried energy into any room he entered. Jeffrey invited him back to the apartment with the same quiet offer: money for photos, a drink, a place to hang out. Eddie followed without hesitation, trusting the soft-spoken man with the awkward smile, and never found again. Eddie's absence added a new layer of danger. His family cared deeply. His sister tried calling him repeatedly. When he didn't come home, she filed a missing person report, one that would eventually connect back to Dahmer in ways no one foresaw. But at the time, Jeffrey didn't panic. He simply told himself, no one saw, no one knows. The smells grew worse that summer. A neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, noticed first. She heard odd noises at night, thuds, dragging, muffled banging, and sensed something deeply wrong. When she finally confronted him through the cracked door one afternoon, she asked plainly, "Is everything okay in there? Something sounds off." Jeffrey forced a breathy laugh, scratching the back of his head. "Yeah, fish. I cooked some. It went bad. Sorry about that," he muttered. She didn't believe him, but the building manager brushed off her concerns. Jeffrey's behavior only grew stranger. He stayed up for long stretches with the lights dimmed low, sitting on the floor with a blank stare, drinking heavily, mumbling fragmented thoughts. Sometimes he sat completely still, holding an object in his hand, a cup, a book, a photo, as if frozen in a moment he couldn't pull himself out of. When loneliness gnawed at him, he returned to the bars. He met Ernest Miller, 22 years old, in early September 1990. Ernest was soft-spoken, gentle, a dancer with big dreams. They talked easily, their conversation flowing under neon lights. He brought Ernest back to his apartment with promises of money and photos. Ernest followed without suspicion, unaware of how meticulously Jeffrey had rehearsed every moment leading to that night. The patterns were becoming smoother, more predictable, more confident, and that made Jeffrey even more dangerous. That night, Dahmer had only a small amount of sedatives, not enough to fully incapacitate Miller so he killed him brutally by cutting his throat. He found peace watching his lifeless body bleeds. He posed him, captured his photos to keep his memory, as he always do with all of his victims. Dahmer separated several parts of Miller's body, packaging them and storing them in his freezer, with the intention to enjoy them later. He carefully cleaned the skeleton, soaking the bones in a diluted bleach solution for a day, and then leaving them to dry for a week. Miller's head was first refrigerated, then methodically prepared, coated, and preserved as an object Dahmer intended to keep. After Ernest's death, Jeffrey found himself spiraling in a new way. He tried to keep himself composed, cleaning and organizing the apartment with obsessive thoroughness. But something about Ernest stayed with him. He felt unusually attached, not to the person, but to the moment of control, to the stillness, to the quiet. He replayed it in his mind, long after everything else had been concealed. For weeks afterward, he carried a strange, floating calm, a sense of control that made him appear almost normal to the outside world. He went to work, chatted briefly with co-workers, bought groceries, paid rent. But at night, the apartment hummed with tension. The refrigerator ran loudly. The air felt thick. The silence felt almost alive. And Jeff, sitting alone on the edge of his bed, staring into the dark of his cramped room, whispered to himself, "I can't stop now. I already crossed the line." His voice cracked as if he were both confessing and surrendering to something he couldn't escape. Apartment 213 was no longer just a home. It was a trap, one that Jeffrey built himself, sealed himself inside, and willingly refused to leave. By fall of 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer lived in a strange rhythm that blurred days and nights together. Work, drink, wander the bars, return to apartment 213. Repeat. The world around him kept moving. Buses screeched outside. Neighbors argued through thin walls. Police sirens wailed down 25th Street. But Jeffrey felt separate from all of it, as if he were drifting through life, sealed behind glass. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere grew heavier. The smell of chemicals lingered constantly, no matter how much he cleaned. A sour odor clung to the air vents. Neighbors knocked sometimes, asking questions with uneasy smiles. "Everything okay? Something's leaking? You cooking something weird?" Jeffrey always had a story ready, murmured with that familiar awkwardness. "My fridge broke. Sorry. Just cleaning stuff. I'll fix it." His odd politeness kept people at a distance. In September 1990, Jeffrey met David Thomas, 23 years old. Outgoing, friendly, always laughing. They crossed paths at a mall near Wisconsin Avenue. David recognized Jeffrey from the bars and walked over with an easy smile. "Hey man, what's up?" Jeff tensed immediately. Friendliness made him uncomfortable, but he forced a small smile and replied softly, "Just looking around." Jeff offered money to take photos. David hesitated, suspicious, asking, "Why though?" Jeffrey's heart jumped. He wasn't used to people questioning him directly. He shrugged. "Just artistic stuff. I pay well." David eyed him, then relented. He needed the cash. Back at apartment 213, David stayed alert, scanning the weirdly quiet room, noticing how bare it felt. "You don't decorate much, huh?" He joked lightly. Jeffrey only gave a thin smile in return. Conversation stayed shallow. Awkward pauses, strained small talk. Jeffrey mumbling as he moved around the room. The tension rose slowly, almost invisibly. When David began sensing danger, he tried to leave. "Actually, man, I gotta head out." But by then, Jeffrey's mind had already slipped into that cold, calculated state. What followed played out like the same pattern he had been perfecting. The same methodical calm. Afterward, Jeffrey sat on the floor of the living room, hands shaking, whispering to himself in frustration. He wasn't right. He wasn't what I wanted. His voice cracked in disappointment, as if losing control wasn't the part that bothered him, but losing the feeling he hoped for. For weeks, Jeffrey avoided the bars. He stayed inside as much as possible, drinking, pacing, mumbling torn fragments of thought. He sat in the dark, with the TV glowing faintly, but he barely watched it. His mind churned constantly with the same looping desire, not for company, but for possession. By early 1991, Jeffrey returned to the bars with a different energy, quieter, more focused, almost predatory in his calm. He scanned every room with a clinical eye. His conversations became shorter, more calculated. He carried himself like someone who already knew what he was going to do before he even approached anyone. Something inside Jeffrey Dahmer had stopped resisting entirely. The door inside him, the one he once tried to keep closed, wasn't just ajar now. It was wide open, with no intention of ever closing again. And apartment 213, once merely his hiding place, had become the center of a nightmare that was only beginning its full descent. By spring of 1991, life inside the Oxford apartments started falling out of rhythm. Doors slammed more often. Arguments broke out late at night. Sirens flashed down the block almost weekly. It wasn't just the building getting rougher. It was the atmosphere around apartment 213, twisting into something people could feel, but cannot explain. The smell was the first thing neighbors noticed. Sometimes it drifted into the hallway like spoiled meat. Other times it seeped from the vents as a sharp chemical sting. Complaints started bouncing between tenants. People knocked on the landlord's office door with wrinkled noses and frustrated voices. "You gotta check that freezer upstairs. Something's rotting somewhere. It's definitely coming from Dahmer's place." But Jeffrey always had a nervous excuse ready. "My freezer broke again. I'm cleaning fish. My tropical fish tank died." The excuses were weird, but delivered in such a quiet, harmless tone that most people just shrugged and walked away. Except one neighbor didn't buy it. Glenda Cleveland, living in the building next door, paid attention in a way others didn't. She wasn't intimidated by Jeffrey's awkward whispers, or his pale, nervous way of avoiding eye contact. She noticed every detail, every shout, every thud, every late-night commotion bleeding through her wall. Sometimes she'd stand completely still, listening when something strange rattled in the night. A loud crash, a muffled voice, the scrape of something heavy. Her eyes narrowed, jaw tightening. "Something's off with that man," she told her family. "Something is seriously off." Inside apartment 213, Jeffrey moved on autopilot. His compulsions were tightening their grip, coming faster, harder. The apartment dimmed into a cave of secrecy. Blinds taped shut, windows sealed, lights kept low. He stuffed sheets under the door to trap odors. The fan ran non-stop. Bottles of chemicals lined the back corner like a makeshift lab. And in May 1991, Jeffrey crossed paths with Konarak synthesomphone, just 14 years old. Konarak was bright, curious, easy to talk to. A kid who still laughed with his whole face. Jeffrey saw him downtown and approached, with that timid voice, offering money for photos. Konarak hesitated, then agreed. He needed the cash, and Jeffrey seemed harmless, soft-spoken, unthreatening. When they got back to the apartment, Konarak felt the atmosphere immediately. Cold, stale, wrong. Something about the room was off. The smell, the way Jeffrey hovered, the silence. But before the fear could form into words, Jeffrey acted. The situation spiraled fast, faster than Jeffrey expected. At some point in the struggle, Konarak managed to escape. Barefoot, disoriented, barely conscious, he stumbled out of the building, collapsing near the corner of 25th and State Street. Residents rushed over, panicked. Someone shouted for help. Someone else ran to call 911. And Glenda Cleveland heard the commotion. She saw the boy, saw the terror in his eyes, saw the confusion. She recognized fear instantly, the kind you can't fake. She tried to block officers from handing him back to Jeffrey. "He is a child," she insisted. "He doesn't belong with that man." But Jeffrey stood there, saying softly, "He's my boyfriend. He's just drunk." The officers believed him. They turned Konarak over to the man who had already harmed him and walked away. Glenda watched helplessly from the sidewalk, fury and dread twisting in her chest. She knew something was wrong. She knew Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't telling the truth. She knew that boy needed saving. But her warnings went unheard. Her instincts fell into silence. When Jeffrey guided Konarak back into apartment 213, his hands trembled. Not from guilt, but from the sudden fear of losing control. For once, he felt the threat of exposure. The reality that everything could have collapsed right there on the sidewalk. He whispered shakily to himself after closing the door, "I can't let this happen again." The words cracked, barely audible, more like a plea than a promise. And later that night, the sound Glenda dreaded echoed faintly through her wall. The same thuds, the same shifting weight, the same awful silence afterward. She felt it like a punch in her chest. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands clasped tight. They should have listened. The police never returned. Konarak never walked back out of apartment 213. And Jeffrey Dahmer, shaken but still unnoticed, drifted deeper into the darkest stage of his compulsion. A stage where fear and desire fed each other like fire and gasoline. By June 1991, apartment 213 wasn't a living space anymore. It was a pressure cooker, a vault of secrets too heavy for its thin walls. Jeffrey moved through it like a ghost, detached, sleepwalking, hollow-eyed. The air inside clung to him, humid, chemical thick, buzzing with the hum of the fan that never shut off. After Konarak's death, a shift happened in Jeffrey. A dark snap, like something inside him had broken loose and stopped pretending to be controllable. His fear of being caught didn't slow him down. Instead, it accelerated him, made him reckless, desperate, hungry. On June 30th, 1991, he met Matt Turner at Chicago Pride. Matt was open, friendly, trusting. A 20-year-old kid finding community, finding belonging. Jeffrey lured him back to Milwaukee with promises of photos and a place to hang out. Matt crossed the threshold of apartment 213 and vanished. Well, not completely. His torso was put inside the blue barrel he kept in his room. The other parts of him were inside Dahmer's refrigerator. And less than a week later came Jeremiah Weinberger, someone who almost escaped the pattern by sheer intuition. Jeremiah liked Jeffrey at first, but the moment he stepped inside that apartment, he froze a little. Jeremiah wasn't naive. He sensed something was wrong. "You always keep it this warm in here?" he asked. "The sealed windows, the stale air." Jeffrey murmured, "Yeah, I like it quiet." Jeremiah didn't. He left that night, unsettled. But Jeffrey wasn't done. He tracked him down the next day and convinced him to return. A fatal second chance. By mid-July, Jeffrey was spiraling into a frenzy. He barely slept, barely ate. He wandered aisles of hardware stores in a trance, buying chemicals, bags, tools. The clerks barely looked at him, just another quiet guy passing through. Inside apartment 213, the layout twisted into something monstrous. The blue barrel in the corner became a permanent landmark, sealed tight, always warm. The fridge held things no fridge ever should. The bedroom closet hid what Jeffrey called "my private things," arranged with obsessive precision. And the smell, raw, dense, sour, grew into something that stabbed the back of the throat. Even bleach couldn't fight it anymore. One night, as Jeffrey paced the apartment, anxious and trembling, a loud knock rattled the door. His heart slammed in his chest. He froze. Another knock, harder this time. "Maintenance," a voice called. "We need to check the vents." Jeffrey swallowed hard, panic rising like a tide. He cracked the door open an inch, eyes wide. "Can you come back tomorrow?" he whispered. "I'm busy." The maintenance man sighed, annoyed but tired. "Fine, tomorrow." Jeffrey closed the door and leaned against it, trembling. "I'm losing control," he muttered. And still, he kept going. July 12th, 1991. He met Oliver Lacey. July 19th, 1991. He met Joseph Braidhoft, a father of 3, just trying to get back on his feet. Both walked willingly into the apartment. Both trusted the wrong, quiet voice. Both disappeared into the black hole Jeffrey had become. By now, the neighbors started to complain daily. Someone even threatened to move out. They heard drills, thuds, smells that came in waves and made them gag mid-sentence. But every time the landlord knocked, Jeffrey made ridiculous excuses, but delivered with such stillness that people backed down. Glenda Cleveland, however, didn't back down. From her apartment next door, she listened with her whole soul, and what she heard terrified her. Heavy shifting sounds, rhythmic scraping, that same awful silence afterward. She called the police more than once, "Check that man's apartment," she insisted. "Something is happening in there." But every call ended the same. "We'll look into it." They never did. Meanwhile, Jeffrey sat in the middle of his dark apartment, the fan buzzing, the chemicals burning his lungs, the walls closing in. For the first time, he felt something crack inside him, a strange mix of self-hatred and obsession. A whisper slipped out of his mouth as he stared into the shadows. "I can't stop now." A confession to no one, a sentence passed on himself. Outside, the city carried on. People laughing, working, living, unaware that inside a single apartment on North 25th Street, the deadliest chapter of Jeffrey Dahmer's story was being written in real time. And the walls were starting to give way. The neighbors were done staying silent. The police were weeks from knocking. And Jeffrey, he was running out of time. By July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was unraveling fast. His apartment felt smaller every day, tighter, hotter, like the walls were pressing inward with every breath he took. The fan rattled non-stop. The chemicals burned his eyes. Even he couldn't stand the smell anymore, though he kept pretending he could. The neighbors were officially done. The hallway buzzed with complaints, angry knocks, arguments, whispered warnings. Someone scrawled a note on the bulletin board. "Whatever's coming from 213 needs to stop." But nothing stopped. If anything, Jeffrey's behavior got darker, quicker, more frantic. On July 22nd, 1991, Milwaukee's summer heat clung to the streets like glue. Jeffrey wandered outside that evening, pacing with a jittery edge, scanning quietly for his next target. Someone who wouldn't notice the unease in his voice. Someone who needed the cash badly enough to follow him. That's when he saw Tracy Edwards, 32 years old, walking with two friends near Marquette University. Tracy was cautious by nature, sharper than most, but Jeffrey approached softly, offering $100 for photos. Money was tight, the night was calm, and Jeffrey seemed, well, awkward but harmless. Tracy hesitated. His friends warned him. But eventually, he nodded. "Fine, I'll go. I'll be quick." The moment Tracy stepped inside apartment 213, he stalled. The smell hit him first, thick, chemical, sour. The windows were sealed. The living room was dim, cluttered. Something about the air felt wrong, charged, heavy. He muttered, "Man, what's that smell?" Jeffrey forced a quick smile. "It's the sewer. It backs up sometimes." His voice wobbled. His hands shook. Tracy clocked everything. The blue barrel in the corner, the odd stains on the rug, the camera on the couch. Something inside his chest tightened. His instincts whispered sharply, "Be careful." But Jeffrey shifted suddenly, his tone going from timid to tense in seconds. He sat beside Tracy, murmuring something odd, something soft and disconnected. Then, with a shaky breath, he pressed a knife against Tracy's side. "Do what I say, and I won't hurt you." Tracy froze, heart pounding, eyes wide. But even in panic, he stayed calm, analyzing, watching, waiting. Jeffrey tried to handcuff him. One cuff clicked shut around Tracy's wrist, but he jerked his arm hard enough that the second cuff missed. He forced a slow laugh, acting unfazed. "Nah, man. Look, let's just chill. Let's watch a movie." He spoke softly, almost playfully, just enough to stall Jeffrey's next move. For nearly an hour, Tracy played a mental chess match with a man who'd already crossed the line between fear and compulsion. He kept talking, distracting, easing Jeffrey down whenever he tensed, all while scanning the room for exits, for weapons, for anything. His heartbeat hammered like a drum. At one moment, Jeffrey drifted into a trance, staring at the TV, about wanting to keep Tracy, his words slipping between exhaustion and obsession. Tracy knew this was his only chance. He inhaled sharply, his muscles coiled, and then he ran. He shoved Jeffrey hard and bolted through the door, sprinting down the hallway barefoot, the handcuff still clamped around his wrist. Outside, he flagged down 2 officers with desperate urgency. "He tried to kill me. He tried to do something. You gotta come with me." His voice shook, but his eyes burned with conviction. The officers followed him back to the apartment. Jeffrey answered the door, sweating, jittery, trying to play it cool. "It was a misunderstanding," he murmured. "Just a little argument." But when one officer stepped inside, his face twisted. The smell, the barrel, the fridge, the bedroom, the Polaroids. Reality hit like a punch to the chest. A quiet voice broke the tension. "These are real," the officer muttered, hands shaking as he stared at the photographs. "These actually happened," Jeffrey whispered, defeated. "For what I did, I should be dead." Tracy watched from the doorway as chaos erupted behind him. Officers yelling commands, backup rushing in, neighbors flooding the hall, people crying, screaming, running. It all blurred together, but he felt one thing clearly. He survived something no one else from apartment 213 had. As the police escorted Jeffrey Dahmer out in handcuffs, the building went silent. A stunned, choking silence that weighed heavier than all the noise before it. Glenda Cleveland watched from the steps, tears in her eyes, whispering to no one in particular. "I knew it. I knew something terrible was happening in there. Apartment 213, once just a cramped bachelor unit, was now the epicenter of one of the darkest crimes in American history. Its secrets finally dragged into the light, its horrors no longer contained by silence, excuses, or thin plaster walls. And Jeffrey Dahmer was finally caught. The moment officers stepped fully inside apartment 213, everything shifted. The air felt different, heavier, like the room itself finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. The fan buzzed uselessly in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the thick chemical smell that clung to every surface. Detectives arrived within minutes, not casually, not curious, but charged, moving with a purposeful edge. Something about the Polaroids the first officer found had snapped them into full alert. These weren't staged. These weren't props. They were real, time-stamped, detailed, unmistakably documenting what had happened in this very apartment. Crime scene tape went up across the door as more officers flooded the hallway, their radios crackling non-stop. Neighbors peeked from behind cracked doors, whispering, sobbing, gasping. Some already suspected, others were blindsided. Everybody was shaken. Apartment 213, the one everyone complained about, had just detonated into a nightmare in real time. Inside, detectives moved slowly, methodically. "I need photos of everything," one instructed, swallowing back a wave of nausea. Another murmured, "This is something else." The blue barrel drew their attention first, sealed tight, industrial-looking, out of place for any home. The heat radiating from it made the air shimmer. "Don't open it yet," the lead detective ordered, voice tight. "We document everything first." The fridge was worse. An officer hesitated before touching the handle. His hand shook. When he finally pulled it open, he staggered back with a choked gasp, turning away immediately, hand on his forehead. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The lead detective stepped forward, jaw tensing, and stared in disbelief. The contents told a story more horrific than anyone could have imagined. A story he'd have to repeat in reports, on the stand, and in national headlines for months. Meanwhile, Jeffrey sat quietly in the back of a squad car outside, oddly calm, oddly blank, oddly relieved. His hands were cuffed, but his shoulders looked lighter than they had in years. Almost like he could finally stop running from the storm he created. Back upstairs, detectives kept uncovering more. Boxes, tools, chemicals stacked in corners, drawers filled with items that made seasoned officers curse under their breath, and a closet containing objects arranged with unsettling precision, as if every piece had a story, a memory, a meaning, Only Jeffrey understood. As evidence piled up, one detective murmured under his breath, "This goes way beyond a single incident. This is years." Another answered quietly, "This is a serial case, no question." Word spread fast, faster than the department could control. Reporters started gathering outside the building within an hour, cameras flashing, microphones ready. People crowded sidewalks, asking questions, shouting names, demanding answers. What was he doing in there? Are there multiple victims? Why didn't anyone stop him earlier? Inside the station, detectives gathered around Jeffrey in an interview room, a small windowless box with a buzzing fluorescent light and a table too clean for what was about to be discussed. Jeffrey sat still, eyes lowered, hands resting calmly on the metal surface. One detective leaned forward, voice steady but grave. "We need you to tell us everything, every name, every detail, every location." Jeffrey took a long, shaky breath and nodded. I'll tell you all of it," he murmured. Over the next hours, and then days, the truth unraveled like a nightmare being read aloud. Dates, locations, names, a timeline stretching back to 1978, shocking even the most hardened investigators. Officers scribbled in silence. Some left the room to steady themselves. Others just stared at the table, unable to believe what they were hearing. As the investigation expanded, families were contacted. Mothers, fathers, siblings who had spent years hoping their missing loved ones were still alive somewhere. The calls shattered them. Some collapsed in grief. Some screamed. Some went completely silent. Glenda Cleveland watched breaking news coverage from her living room, tears sliding quietly down her cheeks. She whispered to her daughter, "If they had listened, if they just listened sooner." Her voice cracked, not with guilt, but with a grief she carried for every boy she never met, but tried desperately to save. By the end of the week, apartment 213 was empty, stripped, photographed, catalogued, drained of every secret. The hallway was quiet again, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet after an explosion, the kind that leaves everyone shaken, staring at the wreckage, knowing nothing will ever feel normal again. And in the city of Milwaukee, the name Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer just a neighbor, a quiet man with odd habits, or a misunderstood loner. It became a headline, a warning, a legend of horror that would ripple across the country. The world had just learned what was inside apartment 213, and it would never forget. The courthouse in Milwaukee, early 1992, felt like a pressure chamber. News vans lined the streets, reporters crowded the sidewalks, protesters lifted signs that screamed, "Justice for the victims," their voices echoing through the cold winter air. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had anger. Everyone had a reason to show up. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Families of the victims sat in quiet, heartbreaking rows. Some held photos. Some held each other. Some stared straight ahead, chests rising and falling, like they were trying not to drown in the moment. And then Jeffrey walked in, thin, pale, wearing glasses that caught the courtroom lights. No smirk, no emotion, just a hollow kind of stillness. People gasped, some cried, some whispered sharp curses under their breath. Even the deputies tensed up, like the room tilted just from his presence. The trial unfolded day by day, each testimony peeling back another layer of the horror that Milwaukee had only begun to grasp. Detectives described the evidence. Medical examiners explained timelines. Surviving witnesses recounted tense, chilling encounters with him. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all counts. Multiple life sentences. A punishment so heavy it stretched beyond the length of one lifetime. Some families cried. Some nodded. Some bowed their heads and whispered prayers. No one felt healed. But there was relief. A door finally closing. At Columbia Correctional Institution, Jeffrey settled into a routine that shocked everyone watching. He declined protective isolation, choosing instead to work, eat, and exist among the general population. Almost like he believed the world had a right to decide his fate. Some inmates ignored him, some taunted him, some waited for a moment alone with him. On November 28, 1994, that moment came. Jeffrey was assigned to a work detail with 2 other inmates in a small bathroom off the gym. There were no guards inside, no supervision, just echoes, shadows, and the weight of 1,000 headlines hanging over him. One inmate, Christopher Scarver, stepped forward, anger burning in his eyes. He has read about his crimes. Scarver hated him. A confrontation sparked. And in those next minutes, everything ended for Jeffrey Dahmer. He was beaten brutally by a metal bar that crushed his face and skull. When officers found him, he was barely alive, carried to a nearby hospital, placed under frantic care. Doctors fought for his life, but within the hour, the whispers in the hallway turned solemn. Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, was pronounced dead at 10:12 a.m. His body wasn't mourned. There were no crowds waiting with candles, no vigil, no flowers. Only headlines, police statements, and a city still trying to breathe again after years of horror. Per his own request, his cremation was quiet. No ceremony, no public spectacle. His remains were divided between his parents. No grave, no marker, no place for anyone to visit. Just ash, scattered between two people who had spent their lives trying to understand the son they raised. And in that silence, Milwaukee finally exhaled. Families continued grieving. Communities tried to heal. Laws changed. Awareness grew. Voices that once went unheard, like Glenda Cleveland's, finally got the recognition they deserved. It was simply an ending, the only one the world could accept. Thanks for sipping tonight's tale with Haunted Brew. Don't forget to subscribe, and sleep tight if you still can.